Welcome to KNH 448, Global Sport Perspectives, Issues of Continuity and Change, Sameness and Difference. This is Lecture 1 entitled Introduction to Globalization. My name is Dr. Adam Beisel, and I'll be your lead instructor and narrator for the course. As you know, the aim of this course is to develop your understanding of the relationship between globalization and a globalized society and sport. And to do that, we really need to give you a solid foundation in the theories and concepts of what globalization actually is. So within this topic, which is very much an introductory topic, I'm going to do very much that. I'm going to provide you with the ways of thinking about what globalization is, its various dimensions, and then you are expected to use these theories and these ideas and these concepts within the rest of the course. And we might not talk very much about global sport today or within this particular topic, but we are going to provide that foundation or that framework for which you can, in the succeeding 11 topics really in this course, begin to unpack what the relationship between globalization and sport is. So think about this. This is important, and what I'm going to do here is provide you with a podcast of these slides. I am not going to read each slide one by one. What you need to do is to look at them on your own. You may need to pause this podcast or to look at them in greater length. The PowerPoint slides are PDF, both in six slides per page and also one slide per page for you to review as you are listening to the podcast. You can make notes to them, you can print them out, put them in a binder, whatever you think is most successful, but you're intended to read all of the lecture slides that accompany this podcast. Why do we do this? Why do we give you this overarching framework? Well, the simple matter is that I want you to engage it. I want you to work with it and use it and have this framework of understanding globalization throughout really 2 points. Number one is your online discussions or your discussion responses. So when you're having these responses, when you're writing them, you're not talking about globalization off the top of your head, but you use the concepts and theories we've introduced you to throughout these podcasts, throughout these lectures, throughout the readings and the video clips, and you integrate them into your understanding to answer the discussion prompts. So this course introduction is not something that you can forget. It's really that theoretical and conceptual toolbox that you'll build from throughout the remainder of this course. And as I say, I cannot stress this strongly enough because that's what you're being evaluated on your ability to synthesize theory, concepts, to answer the discussion prompts, the essay prompts, and ultimately succeed on your quizzes throughout the term. And so this podcast is probably pretty intense. It's probably double the length of what the normal podcast is. It's much more theoretical. We might not talk a whole lot about sport, and that's quite intentional because we're giving you those building blocks of knowledge that you'll carry with you throughout the rest of the course. So as you can see, the outline for this topic is very dense. It's very theoretical, abstract, and conceptual. There's a lot going on here and a lot we need to cover. So just be warned, this is going to be a lot of information that you need to work through methodically to get into your head and make sure you understand it before you move on to the remaining 11 lecture topics. So I encourage you, as I would for all podcasts, to give yourself a break. Listen to a few minutes of the podcast, put it down, pause it, maybe rewind it if something didn't quite make sense. Take some notes as you go along, but try not to listen to the podcast in its entirety, particularly this one, because it might be too long for you as I'm droning on, going on these lecture topics. So let's get to the first. Let's get to it first then. Defining ultimately this concept of globalization, and clearly that's something we have to do up front to get you to understand what globalization is and how precisely we're using it. But I would say there's no singular definition of globalization. Many people have spent their entire careers trying to define it and point out the many different definitions that there are. But the one we're going to use is a very specific definition with, which is this subtitle here, focusing on the condition of complex interconnectivity. That's the key word there, complex interconnectivity, the key phrase. That is the definition we're using of globalization, what the condition and experience of complex interconnectivity is, and what that means. So from that subheading, you can see that we are talking about relationships on a global basis. And many of the definitions and images of globalization try to capture that globally interconnected nature of it. So that should give you a few hints of what we're trying to get you to think about. And so it is thought that globalization is a word that was first used in the early 1960s, but my hunch is that it may have been used before that, just ultimately referred to something in different terms. So whether it began in the 1960s or earlier, it doesn't really matter. What we do know is that it's quite a common word in usage today, and maybe not on a daily basis, but people get a sense and they think they know how or what globalization is. But I'm not wholly convinced that we have a really good working understanding of what globalization is, what it means to us, and really how it impacts us in our daily lives. And as Held and McGrew say, everyone is talking about it. It's a buzzword, but few people have a concrete, clear understanding of how to use it and what it actually means. And of course, it here is globalization. And we've been told that we live in a global age, but what does that actually mean? So one way to start thinking about this is a video that myself and a colleague made a number of years ago, and it's a bit dated and a bit quite ancient, to be honest. But we actually see a really good example of how people internalize the concept of globalization and ultimately what it means to them. So we went to former kinesiology students and faculty, and we asked them what they thought about globalization, what it was, and then we asked them to ultimately define it. And this is the first video clip. So you may want to pause the podcast here, take a look at the video clip before you resume the podcast. What I suggest then is you think about what they're saying here and their own understandings of globalization. So maybe take a moment. What does globalization mean to you? Write down your thoughts. How do you experience globalization on a daily basis? And ultimately, how do you engage with products and processes and services and individuals elsewhere in the world? And through those vast networks, how do you experience globalization? How does it ultimately affect you? And how would you define it? Yeah, I think the best thing we can say about the video is that some of those definitions were better and more accurate than others, but a number of them brought up themes and ideas which I think are useful. And I wonder to what extent you were thinking about some of these ideas and themes as well. They include the economy, money, business, change and spread of ideas, together, unifying, the spread of business culture, integration, and a few others. These type of elements, I think, are quite useful, but let's look for another definition, and this is something a bit more polished and sophisticated, perhaps. This video then comes from Explanatory, and the idea is for them to explain complex issues and inform the general public. And they do have a YouTube channel in which they do videos like these on various topics, and then of course one of which is globalization, the one that you're going to look at. And I think this is quite good because it offers a balanced or two-sided approach to defining globalization, and it's quite visual, and so you can see the types of relationships and interconnectedness that we're trying to get at within this topic. And so again, this is the last time I'll probably mention it in the podcast, but at this point you want to pause the podcast, go to the Canvas page, click on the link to the video, and have a watch of the actual video clip. Definitely some important and interesting insights occur within that previous video clip, and I think they'll be relevant to things that come up within this topic and future topics, but we'll move on then. It's important to distinguish between two things. The first is the condition of the contemporary global age, which is what we will call globality. And that's what we're experiencing. When we experience the conditions of globality, they are the result of a process associated with that condition. So that's the other half of this. The other is the process of becoming global that creates that globality, and that process is what we refer to as globalization. So there's a difference between globality, that condition, the condition of which we live in, and the process of becoming more global, increasing globality, which is what we call globalization. And the way to think about it is ization, and the end of any word, as it appears here, refers to the process. And so globalization is a complex, fluid, and diverse process of becoming more global, which has created our current condition of globality. I hope that makes sense to you. Now, according to Anthony Giddens, and this is a quite helpful definition, I think, globalization refers to intensified world relations. So you'll see throughout this topic and a number of future topics these graphics where we have these links and networks and flows around the world because it's these intensified worldwide relations that the new global age or the age of contemporary globalization is all about. The linkages and connections, the relationships, the flows that have derived from new forms of economic development, political development, international trade, technological development. That's what we experience under these intensified global relations. And Giddens talks about this at length, and I do think this is where we can leave it with him. But Tomlinson, I would argue, gives us a better way to think about it. So globalization as complex connectivity. Again, I'll repeat that. Globalization as complex connectivity. The world has always been global. We've always lived within the world as a global entity. If we go back to sort of colonialism, mercantilism, even sort of forms of kind of Roman Empire, right? Where there was a form of globalization of international or transnational conquest of acquiring land and peoples and their cultures. So the world has always been global. We've always lived within a world as a global entity, but what has changed in the recent past is the fact that these various interrelationships, the various relationships between different parts of the globe have become ever more complex and ever more frequent as a result of these changing economic, political, technological, and cultural relations. In other words, the speeding up, the speed and reach of those relations have shrunken. So we live in that world of complex connectivity at a faster and ever more abundant pace than before. There's an ever-densening network of interconnections and an ever-densening interdependency is ultimately what Tomlinson says. And that is what characterizes the contemporary global age. There's complex interconnections of people, institutions, living, located all around the world. And I think it gets a much better way. I think this definition is a much better way of thinking about what globalization is. It's the speeding up, the speed and reach of those vast networks and interdependencies as a result of economic, political, technological, and cultural transformations. And to give you a couple of examples, perhaps, let's take a look at this. Now, complex interconnectivity basically means that nobody can live in isolation anymore. Even if you think you're not connected to other people around the world, if you live in rural Iowa, maybe you think you can live a purely American life and nothing outside your town, your state, or your nation affects you. Then, on the other hand, I think we can show that this really isn't the case anymore because of those complex interconnections. We are truly linked together and independent on one another. So if something happens to one place or something happens in country X, it can and does have quite a severe implication and effect for people living in country Y. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. First, we have in 2008 the subprime mortgage crisis, which originated within the housing market within some very small U.S. markets, Las Vegas, the desert Southwest, but it sparked really a global financial recession and crisis, all from a few subprime mortgages in a very small geographic area in the United States. And so that crisis spread outwards to other parts of the global economy. And so that was a sort of economic example. We also have political ones as well. More recently, this is getting quite dated, there are different types of complex connectivity. We have the contemporary Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we watch this on the news and we read about it in the newspapers, listen to it on the radio, follow it on the internet, because we're connected to that crisis from people all the way around the globe. And we have our vested interests, pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, over this particular crisis. And those ideas and that interconnectivity manifests itself in our own interactions within our country here. So what's happening in country X certainly affects country Y, in this case, through a political example. And here's another example, and it's quite a lengthy one, but I think it really draws into focus how that interconnectivity really is inextricably linked. And it's what we could call the Chinese pork miracle. And let's try and work through this, and again, it's a bit of a long example, on how the rising consumption of pork in China is having effects on other parts of the world, because it seems quite a localized phenomenon. Chinese are eating more pork now as The reason for that, we can sort of speculate, but we think, or most scholars would argue, that it's the rising affluence within Chinese culture, able to afford a higher consumable, this being pork. So the Chinese economy is becoming more consumer or market driven. There is more affluence within Chinese consumer culture, and therefore there is a higher consumption rate of pork. This is described as the Chinese pork miracle, and you can see the rate of Chinese consumption of pork over U.S. consumption, which has remained largely steady over the last few years. And so the Chinese consumption has really gone through the roof as the Chinese economy has become more consumer-based. And you can argue that there is a link there that has a complex connectivity, that there is this globalization of consumer culture. So even the Chinese state socialist system has created this change. But there have been effects that we can think through internally that ripple through the global economy. So as an effect of this, of course, is Brazilian deforestation. And that's one of the effects of this Chinese pork miracle, that there's a direct link between the rainforest in Brazil as being deforested and turning into agricultural land to grow soybeans. Why soybeans? Because those soybeans are exported to China to feed the growing number of pigs on these massive pig farms to adequately stock and plenish the rising consumption of pork. So there's a relationship here between the deforestation in Brazil, turning that land into agricultural land to grow soybeans, which are fed to pigs in China to continue feeding this Chinese pork miracle. Okay? So we can see how something like the climate or the environment gets picked up as a result of changing consumer preferences and growing consumer culture in a country halfway around the globe. And here's another one of those diagrams or images, and as McGuire and Jarvie and Mansfield and Bradley say, interdependency chains are the networks that have interconnected people from different parts of the world. So I want you to start thinking about those interconnections or interdependency chains. In our previous example, somebody living in Brazil is now connected to somebody living in China, whether they're a farmer or a consumer or they're simply just eating their pork. So I want you to take a moment and think about the goods you're consuming. You are linked. You have that interconnectivity to the workers that produce those global commodities or services that you're consuming, and their work is embodied in that commodity. So if you go to buy a pair of Adidas sandals, the labor is embodied in that commodity from the factory halfway around the world in Vietnam where they were manufactured. So we are increasingly interconnected through these chains as a result of globalization. And in all of these different ways, I think you can find that you live a complex life of interdependency. So as much as you might think that you live a bit in isolation or you reject some of the impacts of globalization, your life is a web of complex global interconnectivity. So life is now that complex web, and it's hard to sort of break free of it, whether it's economic, technological, environmental, or even political. And now we've just gone over a couple of examples, and we'll get into much more of them later, but those are the interdependencies that are characteristic of globality or globalization, again, that process of becoming more global, that help us define this golden age. And if you want to get the working definition of globalization, I think it is the combination of interdependency and complex connectivity. I think what it is the experience, the structure of global complex interconnectivity. That's what globalization is and characterizes the global age. Global complex interconnectivity between people, institutions, and structures located around the world and seemingly unconnected. But when we look at it more closely, virtually everybody is interconnected with others living elsewhere. So this is the definition we're going to go with then. And as Benjamin Barber noted, I think it is a great quote, and this is why I've chosen to quote it at length. Quote, "The truth is that there is almost nothing in life that doesn't depend, one way or another, on people someplace else." That goes for things like entertainment, electronics, clothes, food, and of course sport. And also all the bad things such as global warming, diseases, drugs, crime, terrorism. So we think, so we are indeed interconnected with someplace else, people and institutions somewhere located elsewhere. So interdependence, according to Barber, is not a theory or an idea, it is our reality. It is the way I think we need to think about it. Globalization as a complex global interconnectivity. So if that's what globality is, if that's what the process of globalization leads us to, what we have to think about is what has caused this and what are its effects. Because I think that gives us a better understanding of the world we live in. We know what it is definitionally, but where does globalization come from and what impact does it have on our lives? To explain the rise of globalization, we're going to turn to a particular theory called world systems theory, because I think it is one of many, many different globalization theories, but this is a good one and a good way of understanding the emergence of globalization and the type of globalization we're experiencing at the moment. In other words, world systems theory, which is very much an economically oriented theory, allows us to speak to and explain this rise of global corporate capitalism. And this, the world systems theory, was devised by this fellow named Emanuel Wallerstein. And he provides a model for understanding the contemporary corporate capitalist economy. And that's the economy, that's the way we're going to define the current economy in the current global moment. So this is the basis of Wallerstein's world systems theory. Wallerstein said that the world system is made up of different types of societies, different areas, different structures, different states that were unequal in relation to each other. Some were more powerful than others, whether it was militarily, technologically, and crucially, economically. So he identified three types of areas around the globe. The first were what he defined as core areas. And as the name implies, these are the economic, political, and cultural powers in the global structure. And they are likely to exploit other areas for commercial or economic gain. Opposite the core areas are the periphery areas. And as the name implies, these are the less powerful areas on the margins of the global economy. They're the states, the societies, the nations who are likely to be dependent on the core areas and at the same time to be exploited commercially by those core area nation states. In the middle, you have what Wallerstein called semi-periphery areas. And as the name implies, they're hovering between the two, the core and the periphery. And the semi-periphery states or nation states can, depending on how they develop, can move up to a core or downward to a periphery. So they're sort of on the edge, and in some cases, different parts of the semi-periphery nations exist in those two polar spheres. So some parts, maybe politically, are more on the periphery, but economically or technologically, they exist in the core. But also, he gives us an understanding of the types of world system. There are primarily two types of world systems. One, world empires, and two, world economies. And whichever one you choose, they have a single division of labor. There are core systems and periphery systems that do different things for both world systems. So within world empires and economies, they are different. World empires tend to have a common political system that is centralized around a specific place. If you'd like to say the core of the empire and everything else radiates from the empire, whereas world economies do not have a centralized political system or structure, but there are multiple centers linked by multiple economic systems. So before we get to other examples, let's think about those world relations. And what Wallerstein says is that there are axial relations that are different between world empires and world economies. With empires and their cores, it's based around an axis that leads centrally to the core, in which the core nations or nation states become increasingly powerful. Further from the core means the more peripheral the nation is. With world economies, there are multiple axes or centers of power that are joined together to make a common world economy. So these two approaches are quite different. Think about the world we live in today. Is there more of a centralized power, or are there multiple axes of power that join together to make up the world system? Which side of the equation do you fall on? Do we live in a contemporary global empire, global economic empire, or a sort of global economy, global world economy? As the name implies, it's a world empire, and Rome was a place that exploited the periphery or provinces for natural and human resources, whether it was gold or slaves or food. And we can even take a look at another example. Another example is this: the British colonial system, or the British imperial colonial system, or in other words, the British Empire. Again, and let's face it, the British Empire was about a centralized world empire focused on London, and all about the economic exploitation of natural and human resources of people and places around the globe. And that's what the empire was. It derived and built in and generated, and it was generated to exploit various types of natural resources, be it in India or parts of Africa, even parts of Canada and later the United States, to derive these natural resources for the benefit of the empire, and predominantly the empire is centered back in London. So this is much more recent than the Roman Empire, but it's a good example of a world empire. Now, the interesting thing about world empires and world systems more generally is that they are constantly changing, that there's nothing guaranteed, that any empire or system will never be dominant forever, and certainly that was the case with the British Empire. And we can see this here. This talks about the cycles of a world system hegemony, and this is what Wallerstein identified. Holland was dominant in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Britain dominated in pretty much the 19th century, and then of course the United States in the 20th century. But this is what I would argue for a world empire or economy, and it's a hegemony, which is a situation in which the world system, where there's one system and it's more powerful economically, militarily, and maybe even culturally than other core powers. So you don't get a hegemony very often, but what you do see times where there's one core power that takes precedent over others and dominates the world system. And as we saw in the Roman Empire and the British Empire, we saw that centrality of power in the principal or capitals of those empires. Now, the argument is that since 1897, roughly, or the turn of the 20th century, we've been in a world system where the U.S. has held hegemony, the dominant position of power, or a taken-for-granted position of leadership and authority within that global economy. But is this a world economy or a world empire? The argument is that it is an American hegemony all over the world system, but maybe it's not quite a world empire. I think that's something for you to decide. How central is New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, the major centers of the United States, as the kind of key drivers of that economic empire? What side of the debate do you fall under? Is it more of a diffuse network where there are different financial, cultural, and economic centers around the world, or is power consolidated within the United States? So the argument is that it's much more of a world economic system today, even though there are those relationships or sort of the residuals of that world empire. And the world economic system that the U.S. has really dominated or held to create is a corporate capitalist system. It's not really a centralized system, but because there is diffused power around the world, and there are centralized, decentralized areas, as you know, there is decentralized political power, but it has a common economic system that many of the core nations buy into or feed into, and that is of consumer capitalism. This is the dominant or common economic system. It is hegemonic in that it is largely unquestioned, and it, of course, is dominated by American capitalism, which is why we say it is a world economy rather than a world empire. It is a very important distinction. So let's look at Wallerstein's world systems approach and how these three types of world systems or areas are different within this corporate capitalist system. And I'm not going to read over all of this, and that's up for you to do to make sure you understand what core nations are, what semi-periphery nations are, and what periphery nations are. And pretty much the only thing I'll say is that core nations are the home of the transnational corporations that are at the heart of the corporate capitalist system, which we can abbreviate as TNCs, transnational corporations. So these TNCs are responsible for unequal relations and use periphery nations in different ways than they use core nations. So core nations relate to each other in a particular way, but exploit or use the natural or human resources of those peripheral nations to obtain economic gain. This is the reality of how the corporate capitalist system works, and you could see the geographic layout of which nations of our world are core, those orange nations, periphery, the green nations, or semi-periphery, those yellow nations. But I want you to look at these more closely so you know the roles of each nation within this corporate capitalist system. Then this is, in a more condensed sense, another way of looking at these types of nations. The core are the most powerful, semi-periphery are less powerful, and the periphery are the least powerful. And in a more critical way, it is the exploiters at the top against the exploited below the core nations. Now, I would say the US is most powerful still at the very top rather than the United Kingdom. Then in the semi-periphery, you can see China, India, Brazil nations that could go either way. Nations that have elements or developments that are advanced, but also elements that are still less advanced than the core nations. Then, in the periphery, we have nations and economies that are simply not as technologically, politically developed, and oftentimes it's the natural and human resources that are exploited by core nations that create this effect. We also have some more information for you, and I'm not going to read this, it's up for you to see this yourself, but these characteristics, these characterize the differences between core and periphery nations. There are clear economic, social, and cultural differences you can see among the core and periphery areas. So you should be able to look at these and identify which details make the difference between them. Moving on then, let's look at the details of this corporate capitalist world system, the system we now live in. We have to think about this as if the system creates systems of development or dependency around the globe. Now let's look at Thomas Friedman's book, and it's a very positive account of this corporate capitalist world system that sees the development of areas around the world because of the spread of corporate capitalism, the integration of markets, states' technology spreading, and really the free market economy of every country in the world leading to the development of those nations. Now that's one way of viewing it, very different than Wallerstein may argue, but many others, including Wallerstein himself, see it differently. Rather than seeing how globalization contributes to the social or cultural development of nations or on a global scale, they see it as unequal development. Because where core nations become ever more developed and periphery nations continue to be dependent and lack development. So this is one way to view it, but certain people look at it in perhaps a more balanced way. They view it as elements of development and elements of lack of development, and also see dependencies of some nations. So I want you to look at it as one not being all good or bad, but to see both the good and the bad elements within the system. Some of you may come down more on the Wallerstein side of things. Some of you may come down more on the Thomas Friedman side. Moving on, we can say that these TNCs, these transnational corporations, roughly from the 1950s onwards, emerge and they really begin to develop. And it's when TNCs really become transnational, as prior to that they were focused on their national basis or markets or resources. And as they continued to grow and become more successful and penetrate more markets around the globe, they began to look around abroad for various reasons. One, they began to look for consumers, production sites as well, and became transnational and looked to those periphery countries to enhance their profits. In other words, to enhance their sales. And here you can see in this diagram the core looking to the periphery for cheap labor and raw materials, and also looking to the periphery and semi-periphery to place and sell their high-profit consumption goods. So you can see the things corporations become, you can see that things that corporations became as transnational by operating in different sites in terms of marketing, production, and consumption. So think about it along those three lines: marketing, production, and consumption. So that's the transnational corporate world system that emerged as markets and corporations internationalized in the decades following the Second World War. Those people that believe in globalization as a form of development, the Thomas Friedman side, would argue that these coordinate transnational corporations are contributing to the periphery through their jobs and the products that they provide to them, as brought to these people, and that's created wealth and a higher standard of living. On the other side of things, the world systems approach would say that there isn't development, that those historical inequities between those core nations and periphery nations have remained largely unchallenged because of the exploitation and dependency of those peripheral nations onto the core nation. And that's what this slide says. And again, you need to read through it and make sure you understand this central argument. But very basically, what it is saying is that there are unequal relationships where the core nations are exploiting the nations on the periphery for a number of different reasons, whether it's natural and human resources, and it's even a form of exploitation when it comes to the selling of consumer goods. Large profits are generated simply because they can site their manufacturing centers where labor is cheap, human resources are less valued in developed countries, and where natural resources are also cheap. So let's look at this slide because I think it really helps. And what is going on here is a representation of the core's, or global north's, exploitation of natural and human resources in the periphery, or the global south. In terms of natural resources, we see metals, minerals, plants, bacteria, all being taken from those peripheral nations by transnational corporations in the core. And they look to the periphery nations to exploit or to harness these natural resources for their own commercial gain. And much of those commercial gains stay within that core nation. And this is largely because it's cheaper to find these materials in those nations, certainly with diamonds and other raw materials. Also, the labor being used to extract those resources is another form of exploitation. So we have agriculture, manufacturing, and laborers used to harvest those crops, create goods that are sold back, ironically, to those peripheral consumers where all this extraction is taking place. So the labor is infinitely cheaper within the periphery than in the core, and so it's more cost effective for the global north to look to the global south for these natural resources because it boosts their profits. And it's as simple as that. So it's that exploitation argument that I want you to think about, and whether or not those peripheral nations are indeed catching up or closing those historical inequities that have persisted for centuries. Because clearly world systems theorists believe that the global north is taking these resources at an unequitable rate from the global south, and many of the profits and the economic gains stay central within those core nations. And so here's simply an image that demarcates what we mean by the global north and the global south. Okay, sometimes the former literature would call it first world and third world countries, but the more appropriate and better description here is the global north and the global south. So world systems theorists also believe this, that there is an underdevelopment and dependency of those peripheral nations in relation to the core for some of these reasons. Because this is the counter argument to the fact that they are saying that it's development, that they are providing jobs to the periphery, but these are the arguments, again, against that the profits that are made from these exploitations of human and natural resources aren't directed back to the periphery, but back to the core where the transnational corporations are located. So local profits even are directed to the elites or the owners of the mines, of the farms, rather than to the general population. The workers in those peripheral nations are paid very poorly, so it doesn't generate a great deal of local income aside for those who own the local sites. And also another concern is the notion of dependency, and the first two relate to unequal development, but the third one relates to periphery workers becoming dependent on core industries or consumption. For example, if the core economy stopped drinking coffee, Those who are dependent on growing coffee would face their lives falling apart because they have no income due to the local economy being so focused specifically on growing coffee beans and so dependent on those global trade markets. And then, of course, we have the issue of a lack of economic diversity and growth. Because we have a dependence on the core nation's consumer habits or wants, whether it's coffee or agriculture, we have a lack of economic diversity or growth or development in local peripheral economies. So they become singularly focused around growing one type of product or mining one type of gem, and they don't develop a sort of a diffuse or complex economy on their own. They tend to be singularly focused and therefore reliant or dependent on those core nations. And another interesting way to think about it is this. World systems theory would say that transnational capitalism is exploiting the periphery both as producers and consumers, because you can get to see the goods going from the core back to the periphery as they sell their goods back to those areas. And as consumers, we are all exploited as we buy products that cost more than they cost to make, and that exploitation or that profit is more exaggerated for people in those peripheral economies. So the world system approach theory believes that there's this exploitation at both the level of production, the extraction of natural and human resources, but also at the level of consumption, in that consumers, both in the core, but even greater or even more importantly in the periphery, pay a higher rate for a product or service that which it costs to produce. And here we see it here, and we'll provide a few examples. The growth of the transnational brand in peripheral areas, whether it be in China or South Africa, India, or parts of the Middle East. And we can see examples of that because transnational corporations are no longer just focused on the core, but see consumer markets wherever they see potential profits. So if you're McDonald's, you can get beef from cheaper markets overseas. You process that beef, you make them into hamburgers, you ship them back to those peripheral nations, and you sell them up for consumption. This is sort of what we're talking about in these global networks of both production and consumption by TNCs. And this perhaps is exemplified in, of course, the expansion of McDonald's. They have not hit all parts of the periphery, but have hit most of it, and they've hit parts of the semi-periphery, but as the periphery becomes more affluent, perhaps they will move into those areas. So we can see a colonization of the entire globe within this economic system or world economy. That is all this movement of TNCs. There is production and consumption in all parts of the world, and in many cases, the products of one TNC is used as a raw material input in the product or service of another. So we see this increasing interdependence among TNCs within the global economic system or world economy. And we could say the US hegemony over economic world systems was marked by that growth of global markets, the rise of transnational corporations, which are so integral and central to our lives. The growth of the corporation and the power that the corporation has in terms of the legal system, the political structures, and the economy, it becomes largely unquestioned. And that's really what we're talking about with that word of hegemony. So simply hegemony means largely unquestioned, taken for granted system of ideological leadership. And so we many times look for these corporations. We take them as part of our everyday lives, and we hold particular infinities for those corporations, whether they're Apple or Netflix or General Motors. We derive a sense of meaning and belonging from those symbols, those brands, and those transnational corporations, and we don't really question their motivations or the realities of how their business operations might affect people all around the globe. So although Wallerstein believes that the division of labor perpetuates a region's position in the world, he also believes that the system is fluid, that core countries may slip back into the semi-periphery, periphery countries might move into the semi-periphery, and that everything is up for grabs, that these locations are not fixed and immutable within this world system. And to this point, you can look at the dynamic nature of world systems. You can see how perhaps the United States was once a peripheral nation, moves to the semi-periphery, and then eventually becomes a core nation in the global economy. You can also see some of these nations maybe falling away from the core. So core to semi-periphery, we have the Spanish Empire many years ago, and then perhaps Great Britain more recently sort of moving down that scalar away from the core, and we'll see how particular effects of Brexit and recent political and economic transformations in Great Britain, what effect that has on the economy, and maybe it moves away from being a core dominant player in the world economy toward a more semi-peripheral nation. And here we can look at the U.S. as that hegemonic power within the world economic system. Clearly, post-World War II, it sort of created this condition of what we call hegemonic maturity, that it became the dominant form of or dominant political and economic power around the world. And some people may argue that we're in a stage of hegemonic decline, where as other nations have moved from the core to, from the semi-periphery to the core, or maybe even from the periphery to the semi-periphery, the centrality of the United States in the overall global economy may be less than it was a few decades ago. According to Wallerstein, roughly since 1970, the global capitalist world system is in that period of transition as a result of waning U.S. economic dominance and the emergence of rival core economic powers. A great example would be Japan, which maybe 40 or 50 years ago was not as central to the global economy as it is today. One great example would be China. We see clearly the investment in China and how important Chinese investors and the wealth in China is playing in the overall global economy. And perhaps China's role in Africa has kind of displaced the U.S. or maybe even Western Europe's influence in Africa as one of those chief exploiters, finding those natural or human resources to fuel its economic growth. So the world system of yesterday or the 19th century is very different from the globalization or world system of the 20th century or even the 21st century, because that will be very different than what we see today. We really are still living through the remnants of the dominance of the United States in the 20th century, but as that 21st century evolves and the world systems change, globalization will take on a very different form. But what is true of all these things is that the forms of globalization are rooted in the dominant economic formations, and those change. The power structures change. The core, the semi-periphery, and the peripheral nations are always up for grabs. And we see the emergence of these particular nations as political, cultural, and economic powers around the world that many have argued will be the sort of backbone of this reformation or the changing of power within the global world system. The emergence of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, or what they call BRICS nations, and the centrality of them to the overall world economy. So if the causes of globalization are changes and evolutions within the world system, and specifically the emergence of a corporate capitalist world economy, what are its effects and how can we think about them? I think we do this in two ways, through looking at global networks and global flows. Because the world system or corporate capitalist order can only maintain itself through the establishment of complex interconnectivity of different forms of networks and flows. So what we have again is this idea of globalization and the world being linked by all these interconnecting, interdependent networks and flows that span the entire planet and make our lives interdependent in many ways. And they are interdependent, and these global networks are increasing in their extensity, intensity, velocity, and their impact. So if you think about extensity, the range of them, the intensity, the concentrated nature of them, the velocity, the speed of them, or the impact, the effect they have, they've all grown bigger as global corporate capitalism has become developed over the course of the 20th and 21st century. So now the globalization is quicker, it's more impactful, it's more extensive than ever before because of these characteristics of networks and flows across regions or nations in the globe. And as it says here, people and places are connected more than they ever have been before. Think about your own experiences. If you've traveled overseas, how easy it is to communicate with those back home, how familiar some of the products and services around the globe are. Think about your own experiences and how when you travel elsewhere, there are things that are different, but there are also things that are very much the same. And that is a result of these, the extensity, the intensity, the velocity, and the impact of these networks and flows. But in what ways then? What kind of networks are we talking about? They're economic, technological, political, and cultural. Along each of these networks are specific types of flows. This is the structure or the architecture of contemporary globalization of the corporate capitalist system. And you must understand how all of these networks and flows connect to you, to other people around the world. So economic networks then, I could spend a whole 2 hours on this alone, but you must look and see how the economic order of today has really become much more globalized in multiple different ways. Previous economies were very nationally focused and are now transnationally focused as well as corporations. Capital flows around the world create a global financial network where we can invest in virtually any financial market around the world. National borders within economies are increasingly irrelevant. And that is largely to do with the growth of transnational corporations through sites of production around the world and places of consumption across the globe. So what we have then is a system in which corporations within the transnational economy are becoming ever more important within that world system. No longer are nations only the biggest economies in the world, and this above demonstrates that cities are important, but corporations are increasingly important players in the economy of the contemporary corporate world system. In fact, many corporations have bigger annual revenue than the GDPs of several countries. So the growth of corporations has become so significant that they have more economic and arguably political power than many of the semi-peripheral or peripheral nations. And to demonstrate this, some of our largest corporations have higher GDPs than quite sizable nations. So you can compare Apple to Ecuador or Latvia to McDonald's, so forth and so on. You can see here that New Zealand is smaller than General Electric in terms of GDP. Walmart is more than double the size in terms of its revenue generation than Norway's entire gross domestic product. So that's the economic system that we currently live in now, and it speaks to the centrality or the dominance of TNCs, transnational corporations, in the overall global economy. So as a result of this, perhaps we could argue that cities are becoming more important within the global corporate capitalist system because cities are where TNCs are located, and so we have to think about them as command centers of the world economies, that they are these massive cities. So we have many cities that are fighting against each other to become hubs or command centers. We've seen that recently with the relocation or the opening of Amazon 2's new Eastern headquarters. There's this intra-city competition to get Amazon's Eastern headquarters in the United States, and it's not really just for the United States, it's for the entire global reach of what that headquarters could do for that local economy. We have massive campuses where Apple are based, or Microsoft, or some of these giant transnational corporations are headquarters, which become almost mini cities within cities and speak to the dominance of those TNCs. Another example of these networks is the radically transformation in core economies. The emergence of these TNCs has spread the network and flow around the globe because, as we said before, they're looking for cheaper human and natural resources, specifically in the peripheral nations. And so what has happened is the deindustrializing of the core economies because these manufacturing jobs have been relocated by those TNCs to cheaper local economies on the periphery. So the deindustrialization means there is a greater emphasis placed on consumer culture for services, products, and information industries within the core economy. Whereas the US economy was production-based at the beginning of the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, it became service-focused. It was about the information economy rather than the hardcore manufacturing of tangible products. Many of that manufacturing has gone elsewhere. It's been offshored to locations where natural and human resources are cheaper. And so here we go again. This diagram shows it here. The US may be a place where high-tech information design is done, but the packaging, fabrication, manufacturing, all the components are done within the periphery and shipped back for final assembly in the core, if at all. So you can see the direct flow of goods to produce elements of products within the electronics industry, and this is that industry more generally. In the US and Europe being at the core, but the semi-periphery and periphery are doing much of the manufacturing of these products. So even one product you may buy, all of its constituent parts may be manufactured in several semi-peripheral or peripheral nations. And here we have, in terms of transnational electronics, as we talked about before, not only are those electronics built within peripheral and semi-peripheral places, but also they are consumed in those areas as well. So electronic products are not only consumed in core nation, but they are also sold back to the semi-periphery and periphery areas where most of them are produced. So this is why this is the way it works on a fluid basis. The networks and flows of information and products go all over the globe, and they circulate back oftentimes where they came from. So we were talking about complex interconnectivity and interdependence, and here consumers and producers, designers and manufacturers are all linked around the globe, as this demonstrates. And so does this, the world of a t-shirt. Transnational interconnections and interdependence. From the cotton fields of West Texas are transported to apparel factories where the basic t-shirts are made in China. The more high-tech or high-end printing aspects are done in the core areas, maybe Washington, D.C., and then it's consumed within the core economy. And after it's used, it's thrown away or donated within the U.S. consumer, being encouraged to continually buy new things. It ends up in a recycling factory in Brooklyn where it's sold back to the used garment market in Tanzania. And so it goes from core to semi-periphery, back to the core, back to periphery, and it's quite an amazing way that one t-shirt could connect people all around the world. Moving on to political networks. And again, this is pretty straightforward stuff, but you need to make sure that you understand what is meant by this, that the global world structure is organized in a way for complex governmental and non-governmental institutions that link people around the world, be it the Red Cross, the United Nations, etc. And we can see here, as the members of a nation become meshed in different political relationships or networks, and the flows from these networks are policies, programs, directives that shape how we live. So we may be part of the United Nations, and the United Nations as an organization can have a certain amount of impact on our lives, and the World Health Organization may impact our lives and wellness. NATO, as we considered the military and defense aspects of our nations, influence our lives as well. So you can see all these different types of governmental and non-governmental political organizations help organize people into these networks of relationships along with these political flows, and they incur an influence as well. So what we must think about is, yes, we are organized into nations, but those nations are meshed in very complex political relations and networks as well. Then we have these technological networks, and here what we are talking about are the different forms of technology that make the experiencing of the globe very different. Here we can talk about transportation and communication technologies. In the 20th century, we've seen the emergence of rapid mass global transportation. Basically, the jetliner transformed the way that we live and experience the globe. You could get from here in the US to Tanzania relatively quickly. But at the same time, it also technology also enabled us to communicate with people all around the globe as we live in the age of satellite television, internet technologies, or in the age of instantaneous mass global communication. So not only can we transport or physically relocate around the globe much quicker But information, knowledge, meaning, understanding, and all forms of culture are now communicated around the globe instantaneously. So as a result, people talk about time-space compression and the shrinking of the globe. Effectively, the globe has shrunk as it's a much smaller place than it once was before, and it takes less time to move around it and much less time for communication of meaning and understanding around it. So whereas years ago it would take days or months to arrive by ship from one country to another, from Europe to the United States, we can do that now in mere hours. So here we have a couple of examples of that. The global flow of people and products has been reduced from about 15 kilometers per hour, and now we have supersonic aircrafts that can go thousands of kilometers per hour, or passenger aircrafts that can go 800 to 1,000 kilometers per hour. So we're getting smaller because the time it takes to get around the world is getting even shorter, and therefore there is a compression of space. Let's think about what the impact this has for global flows. It means that without this type of rapid movement, you couldn't have the same type of global economy. For example, if I order an Apple product one day, I can track it leaving Shanghai and can see within the span of 24 hours that it has left the factory by aircraft, it's come to the US, and it's distributed within a rapid amount of time. Think about this in terms of it traveling by boat at 15 kilometers per hour, where I can only communicate, or where I can only communicate by letter, and it takes likely 6 months from ordering or receiving a product. But also, and maybe more interesting, the global flows of ideas, images, and information is now globally instantaneous. As technology can improve or has improved, so too has the speed and reach of communication become ever quicker through such things as Twitter, Instagram, email, the World Wide Web, and it's all democratized communication. And as that democratization has occurred, as we are now creators of our own content through our social media postings, our emails, people like us can see newsworthy events on the street. They can see it firsthand. We can film it, we can upload it, and we can be the direct communicators to vast audiences around the world through social media. So here's another way of looking at it. These technological innovations of global flows in the 1950s, for example, there was this famous sport example of Bobby Thompson. He was a baseball player for the New York Giants, and he hit a walk-off home run to beat the Dodgers to win the NL pennant, and it was known as, quote-unquote, the shot heard round the world because of the radio presence in America. Now, fast forward to Luis Suarez biting on the shoulder of the Italian player Cellini in the World Cup in 2014. It was watched live around the world, and it was also estimated that 2 million tweets were posted following the incident. And this is 2014. Could you imagine if something like this happened today? So we could still call that the shot heard. So we could call from the shot heard around the world to the bite heard around the world, or tweeted around the world, whatever you want to say, to demonstrate this shift within the global network of technological flow and communication. It is now rapid, it is instantaneous, and it's now democratized as we can communicate as individuals firsthand around the world. And of course, technology then links to cultural networks, and that we have new cultural networks that have been created by these different flows and movements by the world system of global corporate capitalism. And their argument is that this shift or flow of images, products, brands, and identities, it leads to this. Firstly, the emergence of a new global monoculture, or the spread of a homogeneous culture where products, practices, and images are shown and adopted by many countries or cultures. A great example would be Coca-Cola. The world's differences have been flattened by the similarity that these consumer networks have created. The second argument is that no, the consumer or world system of corporate capitalism has not flattened out difference, but it's made those momentary differences an important part of the global market, so that there has been a creative reworking of global products to local tastes and expectations, where the local hasn't been flattened out completely, but has become an important marker of distinction of global marketing. So this is a very different argument than the first. that those global localizations of cultural forms create uniqueness. Now, a third, and there's the argument that you can read about, is that there's this emergence of a global multiculturalism, that the new networks and flows of cultures and people created by the technological innovations and political coming down of borders and opening up of nations to different peoples has meant that previously localized practices have now been moved and communicated along these waves of immigration to other parts of the world. So we have this new multiculturalism. So the cultures are more diverse and they are than they were previously, and as a result of this immigration and waves of cultural flows that accompany it. So think about your stance on things. Where do you fall on the side of the cultural networks? Is it a monoculture? Is there a new global multiculturalism? Or are those momentary kind of global localizations particularly prevalent? So here's some examples for you to think through. And these are the monoculturalism examples. Number one in the previous slide, where we have KFC, Starbucks, and Hooters everywhere demonstrating the flattening argument, the flattening of the globe, that new global monocultural. The cartoon shows tourists saying that they went to Nike Town in Paris, the Disney store in London, and the McDonald's and Gap internationally, saying everywhere is the same, where you can buy the same things. There is an element of global monoculturalism, singular culture, when you go to these alpha cities where they are seen similarly and they have similar brands that you're familiar with. However, to compound things, there is also this corporate global localism, where even global products such as Coke become localized to appear to be Chinese, German, French, or Russian. They appeal to different markets by molding themselves, maybe in superficial ways, but also probably in substantial ways. But sometimes they're trying to link to those local cultures and tastes, whether it's the football teams or the languages, and there are various ways that products and services do this localism. And thirdly, the cultural effects of networks and flows is this global multiculturalism. The movement of people and cultures around the world means that we live in much more diverse places than ever before. America is much more multicultural than it was previously, and all these various elements can be seen around the world, whether it's Buddhism, football fans, kebabs, Indian dancing, living in other nations. So we have this multicultural shift, and added to that, we have that enhanced localism and monoculturalism. So in essence, we have all three things working together and at the same time. This quote shows the variations of global flow within the networked world that we live in that interconnect us whether we like it or not. Goods, capital, people knowledge, images, crime, pollutants, drugs, fashions, beliefs, they all flow across these boundaries. They all link people disparately across the globe, and these are transnational networks that are really evident in all forms of life. Now, the effects they have we'll talk about within the rest of this course, but we can't deny that they are actually there. That the farmer in Iowa, as much as he wants to exist in isolation or be left alone, is linked in multiple different ways by multiple different networks and flows across the various global corporate capitalist economy. For example, a farmer is unlikely to be riding a tractor that he bought in the last 20 years that was made in America, but increasingly is generating crops that will be sold elsewhere to international markets where those flows and networks made him and the rest of us globally interconnected. Moving on to the final portion of the lecture then. What are the global relations or cultural effects of globalization? This is quite a complex thing and is another thing I think we'll see come out within sport culture. It's easy to see these things in very binary terms, as the cultural effects either having an influence of globalizing, localizing, universalizing, or particularizing, enhancing sameness or difference, or people or cultures becoming homogeneous or heterogeneous. That is a way of thinking about it, and this is a binary understanding, and I aim to give you two different approaches, but often it is positioned somewhere in between. So it's sort of the merging of these particular poles that I think is quite interesting. Often it's either or it's a complex interconnection of both the global and the local, and they're evident within virtually all cultural forms. So when we look at the influence of globalization, it's never that straightforward. So we must pick it apart and see where these two things interact, where the global interacts and the local interacts. So in terms of understanding the cultural effects of globalization leading to homogeneity, homogeneity or homogenization is really the process where everything becomes the same. The vision of a globe flattened out into low-level monoculture, a giant Kmart with no exit. So that's what homogenization is, and oftentimes it is equated to Americanization. The fact that the dominance of America and American transnational corporations, their products and brands within the world corporate capitalist system is said that everything is becoming Americanized, becoming all the same. And while that's one simplistic argument, mainly because the corporate capitalist system may be dominated by America, but the flows within it are multi-directional, as we explained previously. We have a multi-directionality of corporate capitalist flows. We've got all these corporations moving all over the world, both as producers, as marketers, and even as consumers of products themselves. So you can look at Nissan, Santander, Hitachi, BP going all around the world. And so it's not just the Americanization, it's a global corporatization that leads to this mass standardization where things are becoming the same. And America might be a leading player in this, but it's not the only player. Many of these companies and corporations are based elsewhere in the world, either in other core nations outside of America and the United States, or in semi-peripheral nations. And it's led to a difference between nothingness and somethingness, the creation of nothing cultures as opposed to the creation of something cultures. And this is the argument from famous University of Maryland sociologist George Ritzer, and he says that globalization leads to increased nothingness within cultures, and nothingness is centrally conceived social and cultural forms that are devoid of distinct substantive content. Or in other words, they're generic things, generic products, generic spaces, or ultimately generic lives. We drive the same cars, we use the same phones, we eat McDonald's regardless of where we live. This is global nothingness as a result of a homogeneous global flow. Whereas that is positioned against global somethingness, which is a much more indigenous or locally conceived experience in lives that are rich in local content and are not generic but specific to locals. So Ritzer is arguing that nothingness has replaced somethingness as a result of these globalizing homogeneous cultural flows. And this is what he is saying, that the global sameness, uniformity, generic homogeneity is leading to cultures of nothingness that are triumphing over difference, variability, particular heterogeneity, and the something. Now, there's probably something to be said for that there is an emergence and an increasing importance of nothingness, and we can see this in the rise of what is called the placeless non-person. Placeless non-person means that an individual lives a life based around global cultural commercial flows. They're consumers of all things, and they are irrelevant to where they actually live. These global products are accessible anywhere, so where they live doesn't matter, so they are ultimately placeless. These are a placeless tribe of global consumers, be they consuming Apple, Harry Potter in China, Louis Vuitton in Denmark, or Adidas in the UK. These are global placeless people because they could be transported anywhere to any part of the globe and effectively live the same lives they do in their home country. So that is the argument that is made, and we can perhaps see elements of it in our own lives. And that's the argument that D'Alessandro made, that their sense of identity, that people's sense of identity is less determined by geography, pedigree, race, religion, and instead our identities of the placeless non-person become determined by our brand affiliations or the things that we consume. And we can see this in sport, and here's a really good example. The placeless global Manchester United tribe that has a global brand presence that has been picked up by disparately located global consumers. The man with the tattoo, for example, is Bulgarian and has been to one Manchester United game. Miley Cyrus, or the African tribesmen demonstrating that they are part of the Man U global placelessness consumer tribe, is another example seen here. And these are the last two are the Japanese and Malaysian supporters of Man U as well. So you can see that Manchester United is part of the global cultural network and potentially homogenizing cultures, because everyone becomes a Manchester United fan, and whether you live in Manchester or you live in Malaysia, it doesn't really impact your level of fandom due to the speed and reach of communication, technology, and the flows and networks of the global capitalist system. Here's another one. Even though it is quite a bit different than the previous example, it's the emergence of placeless non-places. So if we think about the competition between cities around the globe and the expectations and design of cities and what we expect our cities to have, certain resources, certain buildings, certain services, maybe even stadiums, they become very generic or a formula for ways cities are designed to attract global consumers and tourists to them. As you see, each of these cities are different places, but they share immediate similarities. So we can talk about these cities and urban places that have been designed to corporate expectations. There is really no reference to local cultures. They are generally generic, and if I show you an image of one city compared to another, you may even have a hard time determining what city I'm showing you. Here we can capture as well in this cartoon all the same things that look uniform. And then the diagram you can see in the diagram, you can see all the global aspects that cities are supposed to have, and you can argue that because of this global homogeneity and flow of design expectations, we've turned many cities into almost cookie cutters, especially those that have been redeveloped over the past few years. We can call them global urban non-places, that they are generally lacking some sense of uniqueness, as they almost all share the same type of aspects, and they're designed by a few massive global international architectural firms and urban planners that borrow existing plans from other cities. Ogg, a French theorist, comes up with a very nice book called Non-Places, an introduction to supermodernity, where he takes this down to a level of spaces within cities. He says within these global spaces there is a homogeneity of localized space that have become generic non-places that are no longer localized and specific to time and space, that could literally be anywhere in the world. So you can go to things like a motorway or a hotel within these developed global economies, and they are generic. They're not different or distinct from one another, whether it be an airport, a hotel room, a supermarket. It's that homogeneity, that they are effectively non-places. So we've got non-places, we've got non-spaces, and we've also got the sort of placeless person as well. So if we bring this all together then, what are the cultural effects of homogenization? In short, they are the erasure of local cultural difference. Local difference is simply irrelevant within a homogenizing world capitalist economy in which local differences are flattened in favor of global flows, products, spaces, and brands. So this is an extreme argument, obviously, that relies on two things: deterritorialization, which is when the local space becomes irrelevant within the construction of preference and identities, and linked to that is detraditionalization, where the cultural traditions associated with those local spaces have become increasingly irrelevant in our values, our lifestyle. Even the products that are anchored in traditional localized forms are now totally lost as we live these generic, globally placeless lives. Now, as you can tell from this, I'm not fully on board with this argument because I do think local differences matter. So this is bringing everything together then. It's but one world. Globalization, universal monoculture, sameness, uniformity, deterritorialization, detraditionalization, Americanization, McDonaldization, etc. They're all linked to the process of homogenization. There are undoubtedly elements of this that affect us, but it's not the singular cultural effect of globalization, as there are other things going on as well. Now, another argument is the notion of heterogenization. This seems to be the precise opposite of homogenization, and in many ways, it is. What heterogenization does is it emphasizes the fact that within the contemporary age, there are new forms of relationships between the global and the local. According to a homogenized thinker, the global flattens the local in a relationship of dominance. Within the opposite argument, heterogenization, people would argue that the global interacts with the local and hence helps to enhance the local, to highlight those notions of difference and say, and as it says here, quote, the global pluralizes the world by recognizing the value of cultural niches, difference, and local abilities. Heterogenizers say globalization does not flatten difference, but nurtures it and revitalizes difference in particular ways. So the argument from Maguire is that globalization leads to an element of homogenization because there are diminishing contrasts, yet increasing varieties. In other words, the global leads to a reworking and enhancing in some ways of the local. The same thing is said here. Heterogenization is a different understanding, and this is about the intensification of local difference in specific ways. So an important thing to focus on as we apply these concepts to sport is the globalization. Globalization is the same thing really as heterogenization. It is saying that globalization has led to the creation of multiple global locals. The glocal, in other words. The glocal is a blend of the global and the local. It is a global outlook, but it is the adoption of localized flows and conditions. The tailoring of goods and services on a global basis to increasingly local markets. It looks to incorporate elements of the local within global corporations. As I say, it is the multiplicity of global locals. And that's what globalization is. We live in the age of global localisms. As Maguire noted, there are diminishing contrasts and increasing varieties with them as the local is recognized as being significant, and the importance of tailoring goods and services to the local is key and instrumental. So here's an example of global localisms through McDonald's. As it has become traditional, it has become global, as it's the site of multiple global localisms, be it in India, New Zealand, Malaysia, etc., tailoring products and services to the local cultural tastes, expectations, and identities. You can see the Kiwi burger of New Zealand that contains the name New Zealanders identify with, and also includes a beet on the burger as part of the New Zealand traditional cuisine. Here is another example of globalization coming from the 1994 movie Pulp Fiction, where John Travolta, his character, talks about globalized nature of European fast food. It's humorous, but it's also constructive to our understanding of the ways in which global multinational corporations tailor their products and services to local markets, and we end up with these global localisms. Here I've got a classic example of as well. This Coca-Cola Red commercial targeted the India market. So think about how you perceive this as being globalized for Indian tastes, preferences, and cultural values. So take a look at this video, and how successful do you think it is for Coca-Cola to globalize itself through this example? So what we are talking about here is this globalization. In this moment of corporate capitalism and this corporate capitalist world system, the local being modified commercially by global interests, but still remaining nonetheless. It is incorporating localities into the impartialities of the global, and so the local is modified, changed, or enhanced, and is done so in order to sell products to local consumers. In some ways, it's an externally constituted form of the local. It's not indigenous. It's not grounded in those local cultural contexts, because it is being shaped by those external transnational corporations. So there is quite a complex issue here, but you have to think about it, and to what degree is that an authentic local or commercially manufactured global local? Another classic example is this Adidas commercial for the New Zealand All Blacks that focuses on the haka, as you will see. There is a German firm attempting, the German firm being Adidas, attempting to enhance itself as part of the New Zealand rugby culture, and so it focuses on a way to localize its brand, a European brand, to New Zealanders or the local national culture by drawing on an indigenous culture of the New Zealand Maori and their performance of the haka. It's quite clever, but look at the way it is external. It is an external form of localization. Here's another example of a Manchester United ad. They signed a new partnership multi-year deal with Chevrolet, an American brand. And look at how that American brand, through this video, is trying to localize itself. And so it eventuates this kind of global localism through a Manchester United commercial celebrating its new kit sponsorship. And then finally, here's an ad from Verizon. And this sort of is interesting because it speaks to that globalism, but back in a core nation. So this commercial was taken from a commercial broadcast of the Cricket World Cup in the United States. The broadcast was only online, and because many of the people that were consuming that broadcast through the US-based ESPN were international, or they had cultural ties to India, you can see how an American brand tailored its own ad within America to appeal to the demographic of the folks that they thought were viewing the ad. So we can even see that sort of global localism within a dominant core nation using a foreign culture to sell its products to different market segments. And so again, this goes back to some of these concepts, but here you can see how through many of these advertisements, it's the nurturing of local difference. That globalization is clearly very different than homogenization. It is not flattening difference, but appropriating difference for commercial purposes at that local level. So these are multi-level, multi-dimensional expressions of global localism. So what can be said then is that the effects of global localization are these. There is an accentuation of local difference rather than flattening. It is a process created by re-territorialization. Local cultures and spatial locations have renewed importance, that the local does still matter. And so then there is this re-traditionalization, that local identities, values, and cultures become ever more important rather than a diminishing of importance within the working of transnational capitalism. So diminishing contrasts and increasing varieties, globalization, multiplicity of localities, and emphasis on difference and diversity, as we said, the re-territorialization and re-traditionalization are all key processes that result from this globalization. And what we are living in is a global world of cultures of common difference, and globalization in the globalization sense to heterogenization. Again, it's the polar opposite of homogenization, but I think there are elements of both within the world and the lives we lead in the contemporary age. So subsequent weeks will be shorter lectures, and they'll be much more focused on sport. So what I provided to you are some of the various debates, the various theories, the ideas that ground our understanding of the globally interconnected world. And what I really want you to take from this is that concept of globalization. Global culture, tailored to local markets, and creating global localisms throughout. And to what extent do you expect sport to play a prominent role in that process? So in summation, these are the various things that we've looked at and what all these things bring together, whether it be world system, interdependence, interconnections, networks and flows, is that we have to rethink the relationship between the local and the global within this age of globalization. So the local is a fluid and relational space constituted only in and through its relation to the global, that those two things are inextricably linked. We can no longer say the local and the global has been separate or unrelated, and like everything else, they are complexly interrelated and intertwined. What I'm looking for you to tease out as we discuss sport culture is to what degree their examples and expressions of homogenization or heterogenization that how they affect the world system, that these are the types of things you really need to consider going forward. And as I will say in subsequent weeks, we are looking at global complexity in relation to sport and interconnectivity, interdependence, global and local, sameness and difference along these particular issues. And that's why I think this class is significant, is because it furthers our understanding of globalized nature of sport culture. And in doing so, I think you get a better understanding of your everyday lives as it interacts with the globalized world. So from now, I want you to move on to the required readings. Make sure you've viewed all the videos and then complete your discussion and quizzes. And whether you elect to do the topic assignment or not on this particular lecture is up to you. But ultimately, you have a few options to do so. So that's it for now. I apologize for the length of this podcast and how kind of theoretically dense it was and really non-sporty it was. Hang in there. When we get to the next lecture, it'll be much more about sport. It'll be shorter, more concise, and less conceptual.